Hello, we are here today at Tom's Cypress Incorporated in Waldo, Florida, and we're going to demonstrate for you the way that we pour our epoxy onto our wood products. Now, I do want to issue a disclaimer that this is just the way we do this here, and it is generally commonly done this way, but again, we cannot assume any responsibility. There's too many possible variations in how things can be done. If you don't mix your epoxy exactly 50-50, if the room temperature is wrong, so many things can be causing you a problem. But this is the way we do it, and we wanted you to be able to look over our shoulder and see how we do this so that you can do it and follow our steps. The first thing that we would do, well, even before that, let me tell you this. This is our epoxy room where we do nothing but pour in this room, and we try to keep it dust free for that reason. The tabletop that you see here is just a sheet of plywood, and there's a can on it, and you can see a buildup. You may not be able to see in the video, but there is a buildup of epoxy on there because we just do nothing but pour and we don't clean it up. For the home user, what you would do is put down Visqueen over a tabletop, making sure it extends over all areas that might get epoxy on them, and then set a can out there on the Visqueen and place your wood on top of it. And you do that to hold your wood up off the tabletop so that as the epoxy drips off the sides, it will not adhere to anything. It will just be kind of floating out there on the can. So the first thing you would do after you're getting set up, get your can and your Visqueen, you pick out your piece of wood. And we have picked a piece of wood here, and we're actually showing you the back side, and we're going to skip a lot of steps. We will tell you what we've done, but we're going to skip a lot of steps just to make sure that you understand what's going on, but that we don't waste a lot of video time showing you. This is the piece of raw wood with nothing done to it, and she'll flip it over, and on the flip side is the same piece of wood, but we have sanded this side. And what we're going to do here is we sand it down to 36 grit. That's what we call rough sanding. And when you're mixing your epoxy, the first thing you do is get equal amounts of resin and hardener, and we mix it in a cheap plastic cup. And you always pour the resin into the hardener, and that is important. Don't do the other way around. You pour the resin into the hardener, and the best way to mix it is with a paint paddle or a tongue depressor. You want something thick and heavy, not a popsicle stick or a pencil or something of that nature. And we're actually going to show you the patching process of what we do. And you stir it vigorously. Let me get this up here where you can see it good. There you go. You stir it vigorously. And as you stir it, you can look on our website also at the instructions, the printable instructions, and all this information will be on there. This is just basically a recap. But you mix it equally 50-50, and after you get it mixed, for what we use for patching, we use our sawdust that we have from sanding wood, and we pour the sawdust into the resin epoxy mixture that we have created. And then when you stir those together, it makes a dark brown looking epoxy, and that is what we use to fill all the cracks in as we go. And she's mixing a little more there. And as we get this mixed up, it will become thick. You mix it to the consistency you need, and after you get it mixed up, she will use that together with a putty knife and press it into the crack on the wood. Now, if you have a very large crack that is unusually large and the epoxy it wants to fall through, what you can do is tape the piece of wood that you're working with on the front. You put a piece of tape to cover the crack, then flip the clock, excuse me, flip the clock or whatever it is, piece of wood you're working with, over to the back side and patch it from the rear. And the epoxy will flow through like it was, but it will stop at the tape and form a seal there. And then you come back the following day, and at that point you can pull the tape off, and it should be to where you can work with it. And if there are additional patching needed, well, then you can add some additional patch material from the front side as well. And as you can see, you don't have to be overly cautious about getting it somewhere it shouldn't be or anything, because once you finish this step, you will come back and we will sand it again. So, okay, but that's basically how you do the patching. And then once the patching is done, like I said, we're going to skip some steps. Our next step is to show you the piece of wood after it has been sanded. And this is a piece of wood right there. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit for you, and you can see where the patch actually was. You can see the dark triangular streak there next to the mushroom shape, and that's where a piece was patched. And that's what it will look like once your patch is done. And once it's been sanded off and everything. The next step is you will want to clean the bark off the sides from loose debris and whatever may be there. Cypress wood in particular has a soft bark, and that is what we are working with here. And you just use a wire brush and scrape the sides. And she's doing it rather gingerly here, and that is because this is a dust-free atmosphere and she doesn't want to stir up a lot of dust, but you can do it rather vigorously, and you will dust or remove the loose particles from the sides of your bark. The next step is to blacken the edges, and you do this for a number of reasons. One thing, if you'll notice pictures that hang on a wall, they're almost invariably in a frame because they look the best that way. And this does the same thing. It frames the wood so that it actually looks much better. And you can see she's torching it, and we're not going to show you the entire thing as she's torching it, but you just go around the edges and blacken that edge. Get it good and black all the way around, top to bottom, all the little cracks and corners. And after you get it blackened, you would go to the next step. Now, for some reason you do not have a propane torch, you can also use flat black spray paint and blacken the edges. And then after you get it blackened, your next step would be, if you're making a clock, you would want to drill the center hole and also route the back where the clock motor would be recessed into the clock. That would be your next step. And then at that point, since you have blackened the edges or spray painted, there's probably going to be some overspray and things on the front of your piece. You would want to fine sand it, and we go down to roughly 80 to 100 grit to fine sand the front piece. Your next step then would be to mix another batch of epoxy. This time, obviously, from this point forward, you would mix no more sawdust, but your next step is to put a seal coat on the wood. And with a seal coat, you mix up the epoxy just as before. And this time, she will show you here, you just kind of smear it on with the paddle that you're using to stir the paint with. And you just kind of smear it and rake it around on the wood to cover it completely. And you just follow this process over the entire piece of wood until it is entirely coated. And you would let this, between each step, you wait roughly 24 hours, like you patch it, and before you go to the next step, you would let that dry 24 hours before you attempt to sand it or go on to the next step. And again, with each step, like I say, so after you do this seal coat, you need to let that dry overnight. Now here's a piece that we have prepared that has already had the edges blackened, as you can see. It's got the seal coat put on it. The patches have been all put into place. And now we're going to show you the actual pouring of the epoxy. And when you go to pour the epoxy, here's a different piece. This actually has the numbers put in place for it to be a clock. And when you pour the epoxy, you start at an outside edge. And as you pour the epoxy, you can see she is holding the cup 12 to 18 inches above the pour area. And this works to help you. You're using gravity in your favor. As it hits from that height, it spreads better. And again, you want the temperature, I did not mention this, but you want the temperature up around 80 to 85 degrees is ideal. And you pour starting at an outer edge and work inward, roughly a finger's width apart, and just spiral toward the center, much like pouring syrup on a pancake. It's easier to see if you miss any spots by doing it this way. The initial coat is not as difficult, but because you're pouring directly onto plain wood. But as you come back on successive coats, you're pouring the epoxy on top of epoxy, and it's kind of like glass on glass. It's difficult to see. So by doing it this way, it makes it a little easier to see. As you get toward the center, you can come back and fill in any spots that you may have missed by pouring additional epoxy in there. And once this is done, you will come back, and where it has flowed over the edges and dripped down the sides, you will have overflow onto your visqueen. And you can use a cheap throwaway paintbrush because this will be discarded. It's too much trouble to clean epoxy out of the brush. And you will pick up the overflow that is on your visqueen and paint the sides of your piece. And she's going to do that now. You just pick up some of the excess there and brush the sides. Now obviously she's painting away from her so that you can see what she's doing. But you would want to fill and completely coat the sides. And after this is done, you will let this sit for about 15 minutes, doing nothing at all to it. And after the 15 minutes have passed, you can come back. This epoxy, the way it works, it will have some bubbles form, and the bubbles will float to the surface and pop on their own for the most part. But some are a bit stubborn and don't work quite as well. And so you wait for about 15 minutes and you come back. And of course, we're not waiting 15 minutes because we're trying to show you how to do it. But you would get a propane torch and wave it lightly from a distance just over the piece. You don't want to heat the piece. If you heat it, you will actually create additional bubbles. But you're just helping the bubbles to release, and it will release any bubbles that remain there if you do this. But just lightly wave it, much like a magic wand, just over the top of the wood, just enough to bust the bubbles. And that will complete your piece. You will then come back and do an additional coat, and then 3 or 4 hours later, 2 hours later, you can, excuse me, that's why I'll have to cut this piece out. You come back in 24 hours and pour an additional coat, and then 24 hours and pour a third and final coat. And then once this dries, you can flip your piece over to the back side and sand off the drips that have dripped off, and you will have a beautiful piece to hang on your wall. Thank you.